He was a pilot with 20,000 hours in the sky and a spotless record. She was a brilliant surgeon on her way to save a life. On a routine flight from New York to London, their worlds collided in a storm of suspicion and prejudice. He saw a threat where there was none, grounding a 747 and humiliating a passenger in front of hundreds. But he underestimated her. She wouldn't just file a complaint. She would write an email so precise, so powerful, that it would unravel his career. This isn't just a story of discrimination. It's a story of how one woman's quiet dignity ignited a firestorm that exposed a dark secret and delivered a brutal lesson in karma. Dr. Isabella Reed believed in order. It was the fundamental principle of her world. In the pristine, controlled environment of an operating room, order was the thin line between life and death. Every instrument had its place, every procedure, its sequence, every member of her team a specific role. As one of the country's leading pediatric neurosurgeons, she navigated the delicate geography of the human brain, a place where a millimeter's deviation meant a lifetime of consequence. Her hands, steady and sure, were instruments of precision, guided by a mind that processed 1,000 variables at once. This demand for order extended beyond the hospital. Her apartment in a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn was a minimalist sanctuary of clean lines and muted colors. Her schedule was managed down to the minute. Her life was a testament to the power of control, a fortress she had built brick by brick through grueling years of medical school residency and a fellowship that had tested the very limits of her endurance. She had earned her place in the world, and she occupied it with a quiet, unshakable confidence. On this crisp Tuesday in October, however, a measure of chaos was unavoidable. John F. Kennedy International Airport. JFK was the antithesis of order. It was a swirling vortex of humanity, a cacophony of languages, a kaleidoscope of cultures, a frantic dance of arrivals and departures. People rushed, wept, embraced, and waited. It was life in its most concentrated, unpredictable form. Isabella navigated the chaos with her usual composed grace. She was flying to London for an emergency consult. A colleague at Great Ormond Street Hospital, Dr. Alistair Finch, had a patient, a 7-year-old boy, with a tumor so aggressively entwined with his brainstem that local surgeons were hesitant to operate. Alistair had called her yesterday, his voice tight with desperation. "Isabella," he'd said, "if anyone can give this boy a chance, it's you." She hadn't hesitated. Her own cases were covered, her team briefed. Now standing in the priority boarding line for British Airways Flight 112, she felt the familiar pre-operative focus settling over her. In her mind, she was already in London reviewing the boy's MRI scans, tracing the perilous path her instruments would need to take. She carried a single, sleek, black leather carry-on, a gift from her parents upon her graduation from Johns Hopkins. It contained the essentials: a change of clothes, toiletries, a tablet loaded with medical journals, and a thick file containing the preliminary scans of her young patient. She clutched the handle, her knuckles briefly white. Inside that bag was a child's future. "Business class, please," a gate agent called out, and Isabella moved forward, her passport and boarding pass in hand. She smiled politely, her mind a million miles away, somewhere over the Atlantic, in an operating theater not yet prepped. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the scent of recycled air and jet fuel hit her. It was a smell she associated with purpose, with journeys that mattered. She found her seat 4B, an aisle seat in the forward-facing business cabin. It was a small pod, offering a cocoon of privacy. She slid her carry-on into the overhead bin, ensuring it was secure, and settled into the plush seat. She was an expert at sleeping on planes, a skill honed during her residency, and she intended to arrive in London rested and sharp. The cabin slowly filled around her. Businessmen loosened their ties, a young couple chattered excitedly about their honeymoon, and a woman across the aisle wrestled a squirming toddler. It was the mundane theater of air travel, and Isabella observed it with a surgeon's detached curiosity before pulling out her tablet. The crisp, high-resolution images of the tumor loaded onto the screen. It was a monster, a dark, tangled mass coiling around critical arteries. She zoomed in her brow, furrowing slightly. This would be one of the most challenging cases of her career. The thought didn't scare her. It focused her. The last of the passengers shuffled in, and the cabin doors were sealed with a reassuring thud. The flight attendants began their final checks. Isabella powered down her tablet and placed it in the seat pocket in front of her. She closed her eyes, picturing the intricate network of nerves and blood vessels she would soon encounter. She began to breathe slowly, a meditative practice to calm her system before a major procedure. In her mind, she was already scrubbing in. Up in the cockpit of the Boeing 747, Captain David Miller was performing his own pre-flight ritual. At 54, with over 20,000 flight hours under his belt, he was the epitome of the seasoned aviator. His uniform was immaculate, his silver-streaked hair was cut short and neat, and his jaw was set with a permanent expression of authority. He'd spent 10 years in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation, and he ran his cockpit with military precision. "Checklist complete, Captain," his first officer. A young, eager man named Ben Carter announced. "Good." Miller grunted, his eyes scanning the array of dials and screens. "Weather over the pond looks clear. A bit of chop near Gander, but nothing this old girl can't handle." He patted the console affectionately. He trusted his plane. It was people he wasn't so sure about. The world in David Miller's view had become an increasingly dangerous and nonsensical place. He saw threats everywhere, not just on the radar, but in the news on the streets, in the changing fabric of the country he felt he no longer recognized. He'd spent his life following rules and respecting chains of command, and he had little patience for those who didn't. His vigilance, he believed, was his greatest asset as a pilot. It was what kept his passengers safe. It was his sacred duty. A flight attendant, a senior purser named Jennifer, knocked lightly on the cockpit door before entering. "Cabin's secure, Captain. We're ready for pushback." "Thanks, Jen," Miller said, not turning around. "Any issues?" "Just the usual," she replied with a sigh. "Aisle blockers overhead being warriors. Oh, and a woman in business made a bit of a scene." Miller's attention sharpened. "What kind of scene?" "Not a scene, really," Jennifer corrected herself, realizing her captain's penchant for alarm. "Just odd. A passenger in 4B. When I went to check her seatbelt, she had her eyes closed and was breathing very heavily, almost like she was in a trance. I asked if she was all right, and she just opened her eyes, stared right through me, and said, 'I'm fine.' Then closed them again. Didn't even really look at me. A bit spooky." "What did she look like?" Miller asked, his tone still casual, but a new note of inquiry in it. "Black woman? Very well dressed. Probably in her 30s. Ben Carter, the first officer, chuckled. "Probably just a nervous flyer, Dave. Some people meditate to calm themselves down." Miller didn't respond. He was picturing it. A well-dressed black woman, breathing heavily, staring blankly. It didn't fit. Nervous flyers fidgeted, they asked for water, they made small talk. They didn't go into a trance. The word spooky echoed in his mind. In his carefully ordered world, things that were odd or spooky were red flags. They were deviations from the norm that required scrutiny. "All right, Jen, keep an eye on her," he said. His voice was flat, betraying no emotion. "Let me know if she does anything else out of the ordinary." "Will do, Captain," Jennifer said, giving a little shrug as she backed out of the cockpit. To her it was a forgettable, minorly strange interaction. To Captain David Miller, it was the beginning of a pattern. It was a loose thread that in his mind needed to be pulled. Pushback was smooth. The four massive engines of the 747 spooled up with a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the cabin. For most passengers, it was a comforting sound, the promise of a journey beginning. For Dr. Isabella Reed, it was background noise. She had drifted into a state of deep concentration, her mind still mapping the labyrinth of the boy's brain. The rhythmic breathing Jennifer, the flight attendant, had found so strange was simply her method for achieving absolute focus, a technique she'd used for years. It walled off the distractions of the world, allowing her to descend into the clinical purity of her work. The plane taxied for what felt like an eternity, the New York skyline retreating in the distance. Finally, it paused, holding short of the runway. Isabella opened her eyes, blinking as she adjusted to the cabin lights. She glanced at her watch. They were slightly behind schedule, but nothing unusual for JFK. She felt a pang of hunger and flagged down a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Could I possibly have a glass of water and perhaps some nuts before takeoff?" The flight attendant, a young man with a nervous smile, nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Let me just check if we're permitted once we're on the active runway." As he moved toward the galley, Isabella's gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin. She noticed the senior purser, Jennifer, speaking in hushed, urgent tones into the phone for the cockpit. Jennifer's eyes darted around the cabin before briefly landing on Isabella. It was a fleeting glance, but it was sharp, laced with something Isabella couldn't quite decipher. Annoyance, suspicion. She dismissed it. Flight attendants had stressful jobs. A few minutes later, Jennifer's voice came over the PA system, a strained cheerfulness in her tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has asked me to apologize for a slight delay. We're just sorting out a minor technical issue and should be on our way shortly. We appreciate your patience." A collective, quiet groan rippled through the cabin. Delays were common, but the explanation felt vague, hollow. Isabella felt a prickle of irritation. Every minute they sat on the tarmac was a minute stolen from the little boy in London. She took a deep breath, pushing the frustration down. Control, she reminded herself. Control what you can control. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was anything but calm. "What do you mean, keep an eye on her?" Ben Carter, the first officer, was asking, his voice a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Dave, she asked for a glass of water." "It's not just the water, Ben. It's the whole picture," Miller retorted, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. "The trance-like state, the staring. Now she's asking for service before we're even in the air. It's aberrant behavior." "It's the behavior of a business-class passenger," Ben argued, his voice rising. "They expect a certain level of service, and the trance was probably meditation. My wife does it. It looks weird, I'll grant you." "Your wife isn't a stranger on a plane I'm responsible for," Miller snapped. The finality in his tone shut Ben up. Miller toggled the intercom. "Jen, it's the captain." "Go ahead, Captain," her voice crackled back. "The passenger in 4B. Has she touched her overhead bag at all since she boarded?" There was a pause. I don't believe so, Captain. She put it up when she first got on, and that was it." "And what's in the bag? I don't know, I can't just ask to look in her bag." Jennifer's voice was now frayed with stress. She was an experienced purser, but this was a situation she'd never encountered. A captain's paranoia was a delicate thing to manage. "Just stay vigilant," Miller ordered before cutting the connection. He turned to Ben. "I've got a bad feeling. A real bad feeling. I don't like her demeanor. She's too calm, too detached. It's not right." "Dave, for God's sake, what are you suggesting?" Ben asked, aghast. "That she's some kind of threat because she's calm." "It's the calm before the storm," Miller said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She's observing, waiting. I'm not risking the lives of 300 people based on your wife's yoga class." Without another word, Miller got on the radio to air traffic control. "Tower, this is Speedbird 112. We're going to need to return to the gate. We have a security situation on board that needs to be assessed." The air traffic controller's voice was laced with professional concern. "Roger that, Speedbird 112. Are you declaring an emergency?" "Negative," Miller said. "It's a precautionary measure. The situation is contained, but the cockpit has deemed it necessary to return." The news hit the cabin like a shockwave. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer's voice, now audibly trembling, came over the PA. "The captain has made the decision to return to the gate due to a security concern. Please remain in your seats. I will provide more information as it becomes available." Panic, muted at first, began to spread. Murmurs turned into anxious chatter. Phones were immediately pulled out, messages frantically typed. "A security concern. What does that mean?" a man behind Isabella asked his wife. "Is it a bomb?" Isabella's blood ran cold. Security concern. The phrase was a bomb in itself, designed to create maximum alarm. Her irritation at the delay was instantly replaced by a cold dread. She scanned the faces of the other passengers. Fear was blooming everywhere. Then she looked at the flight attendants. They were trying to remain professional, but their eyes kept flicking toward her, toward seat 4B. And then she knew. The slow, grinding taxi back to the gate was the longest journey of her life. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her face a mask of resolute calm. Inside, her heart was hammering against her ribs. The injustice of it was a physical blow. The humiliation was a suffocating weight. Dr. Isabella Reed was the security concern. Her composure, her focus, her very presence had been weaponized against her. When the plane finally docked at the gate, the jet bridge reattaching with a heavy clang, 2 men in dark suits boarded. They were Port Authority police officers, their faces grim, their movements deliberate. They conferred quietly with Jennifer, who pointed a trembling finger directly at Isabella. One of the officers, a tall man with a weary face, approached her seat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and firm, "I'm Officer O'Malley. I need you to come with me." Isabella looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the fearful whispers around her. "We just need to ask you a few questions, ma'am. Please, let's not make a scene." "The scene," Isabella replied, her voice dangerously soft, "has already been made." She stood up slowly with immense dignity. Every eye in the cabin was on her. She could feel their stares, a mixture of fear, pity, and naked prejudice. She refused to lower her head. She looked straight ahead as she walked down the aisle, the 2 officers flanking her. As she passed the cockpit, the door was slightly ajar. For a split second, she saw him. Captain David Miller was peering out, his face a mask of grim self-satisfaction. He looked like a man who had just averted a disaster. In that moment, Isabella understood that this was not just about a misunderstanding. This was about a man who had looked at her and seen not a passenger, not a doctor, not a human being, but a threat. And he had used the full power of his position to validate his prejudice. As she stepped off the plane and into the sterile environment of the terminal, she wasn't thinking about the humiliation or the anger. She was thinking about the little boy in London. She was thinking about the time she was losing, and a new kind of resolve, cold and hard as steel, began to form in her heart. Captain Miller thought he had contained a threat. He had no idea he had just created a far more formidable one. The room was beige, the walls were beige, the floor tiles were a slightly darker beige, and the air itself felt beige, stale, and institutional. It was a windowless box somewhere in the bowels of JFK's Terminal 7, a place designed to strip away identity and impose a bland, bureaucratic authority. For the last hour, it had been Isabella's world. Officer O'Malley and his younger, more taciturn partner, Officer Chen, sat across a metal table from her. Her sleek leather bag sat on the table between them, a silent defendant. They had been polite professionally so, but the questions were a relentless, humiliating assault. "What is the purpose of your trip to London, Dr. Reed?" O'Malley began for the third time. "As I have stated twice before," Isabella replied, her voice betraying none of the simmering rage inside her. "I am a neurosurgeon. I am flying for a consultation at Great Ormond Street Hospital regarding a pediatric brain tumor." "A brain tumor?" O'Malley repeated, scribbling in his notepad. He gestured to her bag. "And what's in the bag?" "I have already given you my consent to search it," Isabella said, her patience wearing microscopically thin. "You will find a change of clothing, toiletries, a tablet computer, and the patient's medical file." Chen, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Why were you breathing so heavily on the plane, ma'am?" Isabella turned her gaze on him. "It is a meditative breathing technique I use to focus before a complex surgical procedure. It helps me to visualize the operation and calm my mind." "So you were in some kind of trance?" Chen pressed. "I was in a state of deep concentration," she corrected him. "You could call it a trance if you wish to be dramatic. I call it preparing for my job." O'Malley leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional inquiry to something more like paternalistic concern. "Look, Doctor, the captain is a very experienced pilot. He's got thousands of hours in the air. For him to take an action like this to turn a whole plane around. He must have seen something that genuinely concerned him. Can you understand that?" The condescension in his tone was the final straw. Isabella's carefully constructed composure cracked, not with shouting, but with a terrifying, precise iciness. "Let me see if I can understand, officer," she began, leaning forward herself, her dark eyes locking onto his. Captain Miller, a man I have never met, looked into his cabin and saw a black woman sitting quietly. He decided my calmness was spooky. He interpreted my professional focus as a trance. My very existence on his airplane was to him an aberrant behavior. He didn't see a doctor, a passenger, or a person. He saw a threat. And he used the full weight of his authority to publicly humiliate me and ground an international flight based on nothing more than his own paranoid prejudice. She paused, letting her words hang in the beige air. "So no, Officer O'Malley. I cannot understand that. What I understand is that I have been profiled. What I understand is that your time, my time, and the time of over 300 other people has been wasted. And what I understand most critically is that there is a 7-year-old boy in London whose chances of survival diminish with every minute I am sitting in this beige room with you." O'Malley and Chen exchanged an uneasy glance. They were used to dealing with belligerent drunks and frantic, crying passengers. They were not used to this, a woman who wielded language like a scalpel, dissecting their questions and exposing the flimsy foundation beneath them. Chen finally unzipped her bag and began with a performative reluctance to remove the contents. Out came a neatly folded black dress, a small bag of expensive toiletries, and her tablet. He powered it on. The screen lit up with a detailed 3D rendering of a human brain, the malignant tumor glowing an ominous red. Chen stared at it, momentarily stunned. Then he pulled out the file. He opened it to the first page, a photo of a small, smiling boy with bright blue eyes and a shock of blonde hair. Beneath it, his name, Leo Vance, age 7. Chen's face softened almost imperceptibly. He flipped through the pages of medical jargon charts and scans. It was undeniably authentic. He closed the file and pushed it gently across the table back toward Isabella. He looked at O'Malley and gave a slight, almost invisible shake of his head. The charade was over. "I think we're done here," O'Malley said, clearing his throat. He suddenly looked very tired. "Dr. Reed, we apologize for the inconvenience. There was a report of a security concern, and we had to follow protocol." "Your protocol," Isabella said, standing and carefully placing her belongings back in her bag, "seems to have a glaring blind spot for racial bias." They escorted her out of the room not as a suspect, but as a wronged passenger. The terminal was in a state of controlled chaos. Flight 112 was still at the gate, but it was now officially canceled. Passengers were being rebooked, given hotel vouchers, their travel plans shattered. As Isabella emerged, a ripple went through the crowd of stranded passengers gathered nearby. She saw the looks again, pity from some, lingering suspicion from others. A man in a cheap suit muttered to his companion, "See all that for nothing. They should send her the bill." But then a woman stepped forward. She was the one who had been sitting across the aisle, the one with the toddler. "I am so sorry for what you just went through," she said, her voice full of genuine shame. "I saw the whole thing. It was disgusting." Another man who had been sitting a few rows behind Isabella came over. "I'm a lawyer," he said, handing her a business card. "What that pilot did was illegal. Defamation, false imprisonment, violation of your civil rights. If you decide to take action, call me. Pro bono." Their small gestures of support were a balm on a raw wound, but the wound was still there. Her reputation, her dignity had been questioned in the most public way imaginable. She was rebooked on the next flight to London, leaving in 6 hours. 6 precious hours lost. The airline representative, a harried manager named Susan, was profusely apologetic, offering vouchers, upgrades, a cascade of corporate contrition. Isabella accepted it all with a quiet nod. She found a seat in a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the prying eyes. She took out her phone, her fingers moving numbly over the screen. She sent a message to Dr. Alistair Finch in London. "Alistair, I've been delayed. There was an incident at the airport. I'm on a new flight landing at 11:00 p.m. your time. I will come directly to the hospital from Heathrow." His reply came almost instantly. "Everything all right, Isabella. Leo is stable, but we're all anxious for your arrival." She typed back, "Everything is fine. I'll be there. Tell Leo's parents I'm on my way." She put the phone down. Everything was not fine. A cold, methodical anger was now settling in her soul. It was the same precise, controlled focus she brought to the operating room. All her life she had followed the rules, worked harder, been better just to be seen as equal. And it hadn't been enough. A man with a uniform and a prejudice had undone it all in an instant. He thought the incident was over. He thought he had won. But Isabella Reed was not a woman who backed down. She was a woman who prepared, who strategized, who executed. She opened the Notes app on her phone. The heading was simple: Flight BA-112, Captain David Miller. She began to write. She documented every detail, the time, the flight attendants' names, the exact words of the announcements, the looks on the officers' faces, the name of the lawyer who had given her his card. She was no longer just preparing for a surgery. She was preparing for a war. Isabella landed at Heathrow just before 11:00 p.m. The exhaustion was bone deep. A heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. But beneath it, her anger had been forged into something sharp and resilient. She went straight to the hospital, a grim, determined shadow moving through the quiet London night. The meeting with Leo's parents was heartbreaking. They were terrified, their hope fragile, and they looked at her as if she were a miracle worker. The weight of their trust settled on her shoulders, a familiar and immense pressure. She spent the next 4 hours with Alistair Finch, poring over the new, more detailed scans, the two of them debating the best approach to the monstrous tumor. It was past 3:00 a.m. when she finally checked into her hotel. She should have collapsed into bed. She should have let sleep claim her. But the events at JFK were a phantom limb, an ache that wouldn't subside. The image of Captain Miller's smug face glimpsed through the cockpit door was burned into her memory. The humiliation, the injustice, the sheer unadulterated racism of it all, it demanded a response. Not a scream into the void, not an angry tweet, but a response as precise and devastating as the surgery she was about to perform. She sat down at the small desk in her hotel room, the London skyline, a glittering tapestry outside her window. She opened her laptop. The blank screen stared back at her, a digital tabula rasa. She took a deep, centering breath, the same one she'd taken on the plane, the breath that had started it all. And then she began to write. This would not be a mere complaint letter. It would be a legal and ethical indictment. She addressed it to Sir Richard Davies, the Chief Executive Officer of British Airways, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary. She CC'd the head of the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and the legal department of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, whose lawyer had given her his card. The subject line was stark and unignorable. Formal complaint and demand for investigation. Racial profiling, defamation, and endangerment on flight. BA 1-12, October 12th. Captain David Miller. The email began not with emotion, but with facts. Dear Sir Richard, my name is Dr. Isabella Reed. I am a board-certified pediatric neurosurgeon and was a ticketed business class passenger on your flight BA 1-12 from New York JFK to London LHR on October 12th. I am writing to you today not merely as a wronged customer, but as an individual whose civil liberties were violated, whose professional reputation was endangered, and whose critical life-saving work was obstructed by the discriminatory and reckless actions of your employee, Captain David Miller. She then constructed a timeline detailed to the minute of the events. She documented her boarding, her pre-takeoff meditation, and her polite request for water. She described the vague announcements, the return to the gate, and the moment the Port Authority officers boarded the plane. She didn't use inflammatory language. She used the language of a medical chart, of a legal brief. Cold, hard, and irrefutable. At approximately 4:35 p.m. EST, while the aircraft was on the tarmac, Captain Miller made the decision to return to the gate, citing an unspecified security concern. This concern, as I would soon discover, was me. I was singled out, removed from the aircraft in full view of all passengers, and subjected to a humiliating interrogation by law enforcement. The basis for Captain Miller's suspicion, as I was able to ascertain, was threefold. I was observed in a state of meditative breathing, which a flight attendant described as spooky. 2. I was perceived as too calm. 3. I am a black woman. She then pivoted from the narrative to the legal and regulatory implications. This was the core of her argument, the part she had meticulously researched during her layover. Captain Miller's actions represent a gross violation of multiple federal and international aviation regulations. Specifically, his decision to ground the aircraft was not based on any credible articulable threat, as required by 49 U.S. Code, SARA 44902. Instead, he initiated a full-scale security alert based on what can only be described as racial animus and a profound misinterpretation of benign behavior. This is not only a violation of your own airline's code of conduct, but is also in direct contravention of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race in places of public accommodation, including common carriers such as airlines. Furthermore, his actions endangered the safety of the flight, far more than my presence ever could have. By fabricating a security threat, he induced panic and distress among passengers and crew. He also initiated a chain of events that delayed my arrival in London, where I am scheduled to perform a high-risk surgery on a 7-year-old child. His personal bias has directly impacted the health care of a critically ill patient. I have attached the patient's file with parental consent for your verification. She attached the file for Leo Vance. It was a masterstroke. It transformed her from an anonymous, aggrieved passenger into a key player in a life-or-death drama. It made her delay tangible, consequential, and devastating. Finally, she laid out her demands. This incident cannot be resolved with an apology and a travel voucher. I demand the following. 1. An immediate and full investigation into the conduct of Captain David Miller. 2. His immediate suspension from all flight duties pending the outcome of this investigation. The cockpit of a 747 is no place for a man whose judgment is so profoundly clouded by prejudice. 3. A formal written apology from both Captain Miller and from you, Sir Richard, on behalf of British Airways to be made public. 4. A comprehensive review and overhaul of your airline's sensitivity and bias training for all crew members, from pilots to gate agents. I have retained legal counsel and have been advised of my rights. I am fully prepared to pursue this matter to the fullest extent of the law, not for financial gain, but to ensure that no other person has to endure the humiliation and danger that I was subjected to aboard your aircraft. I expect a response within 48 hours. Sincerely, Dr. Isabella Reed, M.D., Ph.D., Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She read it over 3 times. Every word was deliberate. Every sentence was a weapon. It was professional, factual, and utterly damning. She attached her credentials, the lawyer's contact information, and a copy of the file for Leo. Her finger hovered over the send button. For a moment she hesitated. This would ignite a firestorm. Her name would be public. Her life would be scrutinized. Was it worth it? She thought of the little boy Leo asleep in his hospital bed. She thought of the man in the cheap suit who had muttered that she should be sent the bill. She thought of Captain Miller's self-satisfied smirk. She clicked send. The email shot out into the digital ether, a silent missile aimed at the heart of a global corporation and the career of one man. It was 4:15 a.m. in London. In New York, it was just past 11:15 p.m. In the quiet suburban home of Sir Richard Davies, a notification pinged on his personal iPad, an alert reserved for the most urgent corporate communications. In the offices of the FAA and the ACLU, the email landed in inboxes waiting to be discovered in the morning. Isabella closed her laptop. The anger had subsided, replaced by a profound, chilling calm. The ball was no longer in her court. She had done her part. Now all she could do was wait and operate. She had a life to save. The response was faster and more furious than Isabella could have ever anticipated. Her email arriving in the dead of night was a digital hand grenade rolled into the pristine corridors of corporate power. For Sir Richard Davies, CEO of British Airways, it was a waking nightmare. He was awoken by the ping of his priority inbox at 4:20 a.m. He read Isabella's email once, then a second time, a knot of icy dread tightening in his stomach. A neurosurgeon, a 7-year-old with a brain tumor, the ACLU-CC'd. This was not a standard complaint. This was a 5-alarm corporate fire. By 5:00 a.m., he was on a conference call with his chief legal counsel, his head of PR, and his director of flight operations. The tone was one of controlled panic. "Get me everything on this pilot Miller," Davies commanded, his voice sharp. "His flight record, his service history, any commendations, any complaints. I want to know if he's ever sneezed in the wrong direction. And get the passenger manifests, the crew reports. I want to know who saw what." "The FAA and ACLU attachments are the real problem, Richard," the lawyer, a woman named Fiona, advised. "This isn't contained anymore. We can't handle this with a quiet settlement." "I don't want a settlement," Davies snapped. "I want this fixed. The optics are catastrophic. BA pilot grounds plane over suspicious black doctor. It's a headline written in hell." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the email landed on the desk of an FAA investigator named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a methodical, no-nonsense career man who had seen it all. But Dr. Reed's email made him sit up straight. It was the attachment of the patient's file that did it. It elevated the pilot's action from a potential procedural error to a matter of public endangerment. He immediately flagged the case for priority investigation. By 9:00 a.m. New York time, less than 12 hours after Isabella had been escorted off Flight 112, the gears of the bureaucracy were grinding into motion with terrifying speed. Captain David Miller was at home in his Long Island suburb when the call came. He was watering his prize-winning roses, feeling a sense of deep satisfaction. He had done the right thing. He had been vigilant. He had protected his flight. He believed he would receive a quiet commendation for his caution. The caller was Frank O'Connell, his chief pilot, and a man he had known for 20 years. Frank's voice was cold, devoid of its usual camaraderie. "Dave, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You've been placed on immediate, indefinite suspension pending a full investigation." Miller almost dropped the hose. "What suspension for what? For doing my job? For grounding a 747 because you got spooked by a passenger, Dave?" Frank's voice was grim. "The passenger, Dr. Isabella Reed, has filed a formal complaint. A very, very formal complaint. It's gone all the way to the top. The FAA is involved. The CEO has seen it." "She was acting suspiciously," Miller protested, his voice rising in panic. "The flight attendant saw it too. I was being cautious." "Your caution is about to bring this entire airline to its knees," Frank retorted. "She's a goddamn neurosurgeon, Dave. She was on her way to London to operate on a kid's brain tumor. She attached the medical file to her email. We look like monsters." Miller sank onto his porch steps, the world tilting on its axis. "A surgeon. But she was strange." "Stop talking, Dave. Don't talk to anyone. Don't post on social media. Don't even talk to your wife about it. An investigative team will be in touch. You are to surrender your credentials and pilot's license by noon today. Do you understand?" The line went dead. Miller sat there, the phone in his hand, the smell of his roses suddenly cloying and sweet. It wasn't possible. He was the hero of this story. He was the sheepdog protecting the flock. How had he suddenly become the wolf? The news broke publicly that afternoon. An internal memo from BA was leaked to a reporter at the New York Times. The story ran on the front page of their website, and from there it went viral. The headline was just as Sir Richard Davies had feared: "Airline suspends veteran pilot amid accusations of racial profiling against acclaimed surgeon." The story was explosive. It was a perfect storm of race power medicine and aviation. Dr. Isabella Reed was portrayed as a figure of immense grace and intelligence, a victim of shocking prejudice. Captain David Miller was cast as the villain, a relic from a bygone era whose bias had endangered a child's life. Photos of Isabella looking poised and professional were juxtaposed with a stern, grim-faced photo of Miller from his airline ID. The court of public opinion delivered its verdict swiftly and brutally. Stand with Dor Reed trended worldwide. The ACLU released a statement condemning the pilot's alarming and discriminatory actions. Medical associations praised Dr. Reed's professionalism under duress. For Isabella, the explosion was disorienting. She finished Leo's surgery, a grueling 11-hour procedure that she and Alistair completed successfully, and emerged from the OR to find her phone buzzing with hundreds of messages. Reporters from CNN, the BBC, and every major news outlet were clamoring for an interview. She was no longer just a surgeon. She was a symbol. She gave one single, carefully worded statement through the hospital's press office. "My primary focus was and remains the health of my patient. I am grateful for the swift action taken by British Airways and the FAA, and I trust they will conduct a thorough investigation." This incident, while deeply personal, highlights a broader systemic issue that we must all work to address. Now, I must return to my patient's bedside. His recovery is all that matters. Her restraint only amplified her power. She was seen as being above the fray, a figure of unimpeachable dignity. But for David Miller, the fray was just beginning. His suspension was now a public crucifixion. His address was leaked online. Hate mail flooded his inbox. News vans camped outside his tidy suburban home. His wife Carol was in hysterics. His children were being harassed at school. His carefully ordered world had not just been disrupted, it had been obliterated. He felt bewildered, betrayed. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. The world had gone mad. He wasn't a racist. He was a patriot. He was a protector. As the days turned into a week, a new narrative began to bubble up from the depths of the internet. On conservative blogs, talk radio, and social media forums, David Miller was being recast. He wasn't a bigot. He was a victim of political correctness. He was a hero being punished for his vigilance in a dangerous world. The hashtag support. Captain Miller began to trend. A crowdfunding campaign was started for his legal defense, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars in a matter of days. He was championed by cable news hosts who decried the woke mob that had come for a good man just doing his job. Miller, isolated and adrift, clung to this narrative like a life raft. He wasn't wrong. He was misunderstood. He wasn't prejudiced. He was prudent. Encouraged by his new supporters and a firebrand lawyer hired by the crowdfunding campaign, he decided to fight back. He agreed to a primetime television interview. He sat across from a sympathetic host, his face etched with worry, presented as a man wronged. "I saw something that didn't feel right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. My gut, after 30,000 hours in the air, told me to be cautious. This was never about race. It was about security. I would do it again in a heartbeat if it meant keeping my passengers safe. My career, my life has been destroyed because I chose to be safe rather than sorry. The interview was a massive success for his supporters. It galvanized his base and poured fuel on the culture war fire. He was no longer just a suspended pilot. He was a cause célèbre, a martyr in the fight against liberal overreach. In London, Isabella watched a clip of the interview online, a deep sense of unease settling over her. She had won the initial battle. Miller was suspended. The airline was compliant. But she now saw that she hadn't just confronted a man. She had stirred a sleeping dragon. The clear, clean lines of right and wrong were being blurred by a storm of political outrage. She had wanted accountability. She had gotten a war. And she had a terrifying feeling that the worst was yet to come. The official FAA hearing was scheduled for a cold, gray day in January, 3 months after the incident. In that time, the conflict had metastasized. It was no longer Dr. Reed versus Captain Miller. It was a national spectacle, a proxy war fought on cable news and social media. Miller, bolstered by his newfound fame, and a formidable legal team had been fully exonerated in the court of public opinion that mattered to him. He was a folk hero. Isabella, by contrast, had maintained a public silence, refusing all interviews. She had returned to her work, finding solace in the sterile, apolitical world of the operating room. But she couldn't escape the fallout. She was inundated with hate mail, vile, racist screeds that called her an opportunist, a liar, a race baiter. Her employer, Johns Hopkins, stood by her, but the pressure was immense. She had wanted quiet justice. Instead, her life had become a public battleground. The hearing was held in a sterile, impersonal FAA conference room in Washington, D.C. It was not a court of law, but the stakes were just as high. Miller's entire career hung in the balance. Isabella was there to testify not out of vengeance, but out of a sense of duty. She owed it to the truth. Miller's defense was aggressive. His lawyer, a slick, media-savvy attorney named Ben Shapiro, no relation to the commentator, but he didn't mind the association painted Isabella as an oversensitive, politically motivated actor who had misinterpreted a pilot's reasonable caution. He brought in Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, who, under pressure and clearly coached, downplayed her initial report. She now described Isabella's breathing as merely deep, and her demeanor as private. "Captain Miller is a hero," Shapiro declared in his opening statement. "A man who places safety above all else. And for his diligence, he is being crucified on the altar of political correctness." When Isabella took the stand, Shapiro's cross-examination was brutal. He twisted her words, questioned her motives, and even tried to insinuate that her medical expertise was irrelevant. "Doctor," he said with a condescending smile, "is it not possible that a layman, someone without your specialized knowledge of meditative states, might find your behavior unusual, even alarming?" "It's possible they might find it unusual," Isabella replied calmly, her voice steady. "But it is a monumental leap from unusual to security threat, requiring the grounding of a 747. A leap, I contend, was made possible only by a pre-existing bias." "So you believe you can read Captain Miller's mind? You know for a fact what was in his heart?" Shapiro pressed. "I don't have to read his mind," Isabella said, her eyes finding Miller's across the room. "I only have to look at his actions. He saw a black woman and he manufactured a crisis. Those are the facts." Despite her composure, Isabella felt a sense of dread. The panel of 3 FAA administrators seemed swayed by the argument of an abundance of caution. The narrative was working, Miller, the vigilant hero, was a powerful story. It seemed entirely possible he would be exonerated, perhaps with a reprimand, and his license restored. The public backlash against the FAA would be immense otherwise. And that's when the twist came. Not from the hearing room, but from the outside world. The FAA's investigation, led by the methodical Marcus Thorne, had been far more comprehensive than Miller or his legal team realized. Thorne wasn't interested in the media circus. He was interested in facts, procedures, and patterns. He had dug into every aspect of Miller's 25-year career. He had interviewed dozens of co-pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew. And in doing so, he had uncovered something that had nothing to do with racial bias, but everything to do with who David Miller really was. It started with a quiet tip from a recently retired BA mechanic at JFK, a man named George Kowalski. Kowalski had seen Miller's defiant TV interview and had felt a sour knot in his stomach. He contacted Thorne's office. Kowalski told the investigators about Miller's special cargo. On certain international routes, particularly to South America and back through Europe, Miller would often oversee the loading of specific last-minute cargo containers. He was unusually hands-on, often going down to the tarmac himself, a breach of standard pilot protocol. He always cited special handling requirements for sensitive electronics. It was odd, but Miller was the captain, and no one questioned him. This tip led Thorne's team down a rabbit hole. They started cross-referencing Miller's flight schedules with cargo manifests. They discovered a pattern of shipments from a small, nondescript electronics company based in Colombia, routed through London, and destined for New York. The company was a known shell corporation for a powerful cartel. The hard karma that was about to hit David Miller was not poetic or symbolic. It was literal, legal, and devastating. On the second day of the hearing, as Shapiro was preparing his closing arguments, two men in dark suits entered the room and conferred with Marcus Thorne. Thorne's face went grim. He stood up and addressed the panel. "Sirs, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a development. It is not directly related to the matter at hand, but it is pertinent to the character and fitness of Captain Miller to hold a pilot's license." He then revealed that FAA investigators working with the DEA had just executed a warrant. They had intercepted a cargo container in London that had been scheduled for Miller's next flight had he not been suspended. Inside the sensitive electronics, they found over 50 kilograms of high-purity cocaine. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Miller's face, which had been a mask of defiant confidence, crumbled into a gray canvas of pure terror. His lawyer, Ben Shapiro, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The truth was suddenly brutally clear. David Miller's paranoia on Flight 112 was not just the product of prejudice. It was the product of a guilty conscience. He was a long-term, high-level smuggler using his position of trust to transport vast quantities of narcotics. His life was a lie, his heroic persona, a carefully constructed sham. His reaction to Isabella wasn't just about her race. It was about her presence. She was an unknown variable. She was sharp, observant, and calm qualities he associated with law enforcement or professional investigators. In his paranoid criminal mind, her quiet confidence was not that of a doctor, but of someone who might notice something. Someone who might see him paying too much attention to a specific piece of cargo, someone who might ask the wrong question. His frantic need to get her off the plane to create a diversion was a desperate act of self-preservation. He had profiled her not just as a black woman, but as a potential threat to his secret criminal enterprise. His bigotry and his criminality had become fatally intertwined. He hadn't been trying to be a hero. He had been terrified that his world was about to be exposed. And in his panic, he created the very crisis that would lead to his downfall. He had picked on Isabella Reed, of all people, a woman whose intelligence and resolve would ensure that his actions were scrutinized to the fullest possible extent. He had lit a match to distract from the smell of smoke, and in doing so had burned his own house to the ground. David Miller was arrested on the spot, led out of the hearing room in handcuffs, his face ashen. The culture warriors who had championed him fell silent. The crowdfunding page was taken down. His wife filed for divorce within the week. The hard karma had hit not as a gentle corrective force, but as a wrecking ball, obliterating every facet of his life, leaving nothing but rubble. Isabella watched him being led away, a profound sense of shock washing over her. There was no triumph, no elation, just a deep, hollow sadness. She had wanted to correct an injustice, to hold a man accountable for his prejudice. She had never imagined that she would be the catalyst for the complete annihilation of a human being's life. The hearing was adjourned, its purpose now moot. Miller's license wasn't suspended. It was permanently revoked. He was facing federal charges that would likely send him to prison for the rest of his life. Isabella walked out into the cold January air alone. The war was over. The truth in all its ugly, complicated glory had been revealed. It was a victory, but it felt strangely like a loss. She had won, but the cost had been higher than she could ever have imagined. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this story would follow her for the rest of her life. In the end, this was never just a story about a pilot and a passenger. It became a story about the masks we wear and the ugly truths they hide. Captain Miller's prejudice was real, but it was also a cover for a deeper corruption, and his act of hate became the instrument of his own undoing. Dr. Isabella Reed sought accountability, not destruction, but found herself at the center of a storm that exposed the dangerous intersection of bias and crime. She won the battle, but the war left scars reminding us that the fight for justice is often messy, complicated, and carries a heavy personal cost. It shows that sometimes the most potent karma isn't supernatural. It's the inevitable, brutal consequence of a person's own choices. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that uncover the truth. Let us know in the comments what you think. Was this justice or just a tragedy of errors?